Hello, and welcome to our very first section in physical science, Unit 1, Section 1, and we're starting out with some review. This should all be pretty familiar to you from science classes before, but we just do need to look at this again. What is science? Maybe you have some ideas of your own. We're going to look at what science is and what is a theory and what is a law, and some differences between those. So we're starting out just looking at these basic ideas. So you all know, you have probably an idea about what science is. Science is basically a process based on inquiry, which means asking questions, and investigations. We're going to look at how we investigate those questions and how we seek to develop explanations about events in nature. That's what science does. So science asks questions, science investigates, and science tries to explain natural phenomenon that it sees around, that we see around us all the time. It does not answer any questions about politics, art, literature, the supernatural. It cannot tell you good or bad or right or wrong. Those are not parts of science whatsoever. So this is what science is about. We basically divide science into three main categories: life science, earth science, and physical science. You know, life science would be biology, and anything dealing with the study of living organisms. Earth science deals with earth and space. Physical science deals with the physical world around us. So it deals with matter and energy and everything that encompasses those aspects of what we see around us. A lot of times these different categories overlap. For example, a physical therapist would need to study life science to understand the biological function of muscles and bones in the human body, and they would also need to understand physics and physical science because they would need to understand motion and the effects of different kinds of motion on the body. So many times these different sciences overlap. Science changes. What does that mean? Well, science doesn't stay the same all the time. Since we are continuing ongoing investigations and questioning, science will change. We change our understanding of our explanations of how things work. And a good example of that would be the model of the atom. Back in the early 1900s, J.J. Thomson came up with a great idea for a model of an atom. He said it's basically this big ball of positive charge, and there are little bits of negative charge floating around, electrons. Well, many years later, Rutherford came up with a different model. He came up with the idea of a nucleus with electrons making paths around that nucleus. Well, our current understanding is even different from both of those models. We today understand that there is an electron cloud that represents rapidly moving electrons, not necessarily moving about in specific paths. Well, because of these changes in science, we continue to investigate the model of the atom today. The scientists that came up with these different ideas did their very best to explain the phenomenon they were seeing at the time with the information that they had. But the more information we gain and the more that we investigate, we may come up with an even better model in the future. And that brings us to the fact that science always uses the scientific method. You've heard this over and over and over. You ask a question and do some background research. This arrow can actually go both ways, because oftentimes when you do some research, you might define your question, ask a little bit different question, then construct a hypothesis. A hypothesis is just a possible explanation for your problem based on what you observed and based on what you know. based on some of your research. So you'll construct a hypothesis, then you test your hypothesis. We'll see just a moment, it doesn't have to be an experiment. We're going to look at how you test it with an experiment. You can test with observations, with models, but let's test it with an experiment. Is the procedure working? If it's not, you'll need to troubleshoot your procedure, maybe set things up a little bit different. If your procedure is working, you're going to then analyze your data, draw some conclusions. Do your conclusions align with your hypothesis or not? Or just a little, or sort of, partially. Well, if they don't align with your hypothesis or only partially align with your hypothesis, you're going to go back and that's what a scientist would do, go back and look at the hypothesis again. Maybe form a new hypothesis, maybe even ask a new question and do the experiment again. If your results do align with your hypothesis, you can communicate your results. And either way, you need to communicate your results. And that is basically the scientific method. So how does science use investigations? Well, like we just said in the last slide, observing. We can observe around us. Right here, we can observe gravity. That's a fun way to observe gravity. We can set up experiments with a control. We can also use models to visualize different phenomena. Here's an example. If you remember in biology last year, we did this experiment. It's an experiment, but it's also a model. It's a representation of cell size. Remember, we used the agar cubes to represent our cells, and we wanted to see how cell size what affected the rate of diffusion of different materials into a cell. So regardless of the type of investigation we are going to conduct, we are definitely going to be collecting data for all of them. If we are observing, we're going to collect data. We're going to record that data. If we're setting up experiments with a control, that's what we just talked about, where we are going to ask our question, we're going to create a hypothesis, we're going to set up an experiment with a control, we're going to test that hypothesis, we're going to collect our data and record our data, and we're going to draw conclusions. If we're using a model, we're going to need to collect data for that as well in order to construct our model. So let's look at how we set up experiments with a control. Variables. It's important that you guys already know this. This should be a really quick review for you. Variables are just quantities that can have more than a single value. A variable could be anything, a cell size. We could have different values for the different cell sizes. Amounts of diffusion, that would be a variable. We have two different kinds of variables, dependent variables and independent variables. Dependent variables are ones where the value changes according to the changes in the other variables. They depend on other variables, and therefore their values change. An independent variable is one in which the value is changed in order to test how it will affect the dependent variable. So in our example with our cell experiment, the independent variable, sometimes it's called the experimental variable, we were changing the cell size, or the size of the different agar cubes. And that then in turn we were looking to see if that changed the rate or the amount of diffusion that was happening. A constant is a factor that does not change. It's something that stays the same throughout the entire experiment. So in our previous experiment, a constant would have been the solution that the agar cubes were soaked in, and the concentration of whatever material that we were looking at to be diffusing into those different cells. A control would be a standard by which the test results can be compared. So now you try this. Let's suppose that you want to know how speed affects gas mileage. How would you design an experiment? So design your own experiment. Tell me how you would set that up. List your independent variable, your dependent variable, and your constants. And look forward to seeing that in class. One important thing to mention is this idea called bias. You've probably heard that word before, and bias in scientific investigations occur when the scientist's expectations change how the results are viewed. So there's always some amount of bias. It's impossible to be completely objective and completely free from bias, but it's really important to design experiments so that the bias is reduced to being as little as possible. One way to reduce bias in an experiment would be to conduct a blind experiment where the researcher doesn't know which group is the control group. That happens a lot of times when medicine, certain medicines are being tested. The researcher themselves, the researchers do not know which group is the control group and which group is the experimental group. And so they're blind to it. And that helps to reduce some of that bias. So we also talked a little bit about models. And that is another way to conduct investigations. Models basically represent any idea, object, or event to help people to understand it better. Models have been very useful throughout history. Here is a model of an atom. Sometimes when things are extremely small, we cannot actually see it. So to help us visualize it, we create a model because this is far too tiny to be able to actually see the real thing. Here's a model of the solar system. That can be useful because the solar system is so huge. We can't visualize it very well, so we can create a model. Sometimes an event might be too, or an object or whatever, it may be too dangerous to study. Here's a model of a plane crash, and that might help us be able to visualize what kinds of things are happening. Computer simulations are also excellent models that can be very useful to help us visualize certain phenomena. And that brings us to our last point. What is the difference between scientific theory and scientific law? Well, I just put this little, I don't know if you've ever seen The Princess Bride, one of my favorite movies. He says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." A lot of people use the word theory, and in science, it does not necessarily mean what they think it means. So what does it mean? What is a scientific theory? Scientific theory is an explanation, and it's based on knowledge that's gained from many observations and investigations. And that is what a theory is. A scientific law, on the other hand, is a statement about what happens in nature. A scientific law will predict what will happen based on what does happen and what is seen to happen in nature. It can predict what will happen ongoing. A scientific law does not explain why or how it happens. Theory is that explanation, the why, the how, and it's based on knowledge and observations. So scientific theory can explain a scientific law. A scientific theory does not become a scientific law. So that is a big difference between those. Here we see that the law of gravity is strictly enforced. Some advanced ideas for you. Explore your own question and write a hypothesis and design an experiment to test it. You don't necessarily have to conduct the experiment, but design one. And tell me about that. Some other ideas. You might have heard the word null hypothesis. Tell me what a null hypothesis is and give an example of an experiment either that you create or that you find somewhere. Tell me what that null hypothesis would be. You could also look into different careers in science. Maybe some careers where multiple types of science are used in conjunction, life, earth, and physical science. And look into the type of educational background that would be needed to pursue that as a career. It'd be an excellent way to get some advanced proficiency. So I look forward to seeing you in class.